I thought I had finally gotten it right the second time around. I had a good job, 17 years, with the same electrical contracting company, working my way up from apprentice to project manager. I owned a house in San Antonio with a decent backyard, a truck that ran clean, and a daughter I was crazy about. Her name was Bree, and she was 4 years old when my first marriage ended. That was my fault, mostly. I worked too much. I missed too many dinners. My ex-wife didn't cheat on me. She just stopped loving me, and honestly, I don't blame her. When something gets neglected long enough, it dies. That's true of plants, and it's true of marriages. I met my wife at a job site. Not romantic, I know. We were both bidding on the same commercial renovation project in downtown San Antonio. I was there for the electrical. She was there representing the interior design firm the building owner had hired. She made a joke about the two of us arguing over the same wall outlet. And I laughed, and that was it. That was the whole story of how it started. A joke about an outlet. We dated for 14 months. She was warm, she was funny, she was patient with Bree in a way that genuinely surprised me. My daughter was at an age where she was suspicious of anyone new who came near me. But within 3 months, she was asking when my wife was going to come over again. When I proposed, Bree was standing right next to me holding the ring box. My wife cried. Bree told her she was being silly. It was the best day I'd had in years. We got married on a Saturday afternoon in October. Small ceremony. My brother flew in from Portland. Her sister drove up from Corpus Christi with her husband and their 2 kids. We had dinner at a restaurant afterward, and I remember sitting there looking around the table thinking this is what I was supposed to build. This is it. About 8 months after the wedding, my wife told me she was pregnant. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I was happy, genuinely happy. Not complicated, not nervous, just happy. I already loved being a father, and the idea of having another child, this time with a woman I was fully in love with, felt like something I hadn't let myself hope for. Bree was 9 by then. She took the news with the kind of dramatic 10-year-old enthusiasm that involved a lot of screaming and jumping on the couch. My wife's pregnancy was smooth. She worked until her 7th month, then took leave. I picked up extra hours to get ahead on the bills. We painted the nursery together on a Sunday in February, and she made me redo the trim twice because I kept leaving drip marks. I didn't mind. I was in a good place. Our son was born in April. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He had dark hair, which surprised me because both my wife and I were light-haired. But her mother was dark-haired, so I didn't think much of it. The nurses put him in my arms 20 minutes after he was born, and I just stood there by the window looking at him while my wife slept. I don't cry easily. I cried then. We named him after my grandfather, who had passed away the previous winter. It felt right. It felt like something was being carried forward. The first few months were hard the way new baby months always are. No sleep, no routine, no sense of time. But we managed. My wife was a good mother, attentive, calm, not panicky, the way I'd been with Bree when she was an infant. I handled the 2 a.m. feedings when I could so she could rest. We figured out a rhythm. What I'm about to tell you happened when my son was 7 months old. I came home early from a job one afternoon, a Thursday, I think. We'd finished ahead of schedule because a subcontractor had delivered the wrong materials and we had to call the day. I got home around 2, which was unusual. My wife's car was in the driveway, which it normally wasn't at that hour, since she'd been doing some part-time consulting work from a co-working space downtown. I came in through the garage, like I always do. The door into the kitchen was slightly open. I could hear my wife on the phone, and something in her voice made me stop. Not panic. Not urgency, just something off. A quietness to her tone that I didn't recognize. I set my bag down without thinking about it. I stood there. He doesn't know, she said. He has no idea. I thought she was talking about a client, a project, something work-related. No, I've been careful, she said. I've always been careful. I waited. Of course it changed things, but I wasn't going to blow up my life over it. I made a decision. There was a long pause where she must have been listening. He's a good man. He's good to me. It doesn't have to be complicated. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs started to feel strange. Long enough that I became aware I was holding my breath. The timing worked, she said. I made sure of it. That's the sentence that did it. Those 4 words. I walked out of the garage and sat in my truck for 45 minutes. I didn't go back inside. I called my foreman and told him I'd left something at the site and I'd be back in the morning. Then I sat there in my own driveway while my wife moved around inside my house, not knowing I had ever come home. I want to be precise about what I did next, because I think it says something about the kind of person I was then and maybe still am. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't yell. I didn't check her phone or her email or her car. I waited, not because I was calm. I was not calm. I waited. Because I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I said a single word. I'd been in enough bad situations in my professional life to know that if you blow up without information, you lose leverage and you lose clarity. I wasn't ready to lose either. I went back inside around 6, said I'd gotten back later than expected. She made dinner. We ate together. My son sat in his little seat at the end of the table and banged a spoon on the tray. I watched my wife laugh at him, and I felt something hollow opening in my chest that I couldn't close. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid attention to things I'd been too comfortable to notice before. How she angled her phone away when she texted at night. How she sometimes took calls outside, which she'd never done before the baby. The way she answered certain questions with a slight pause before the word. Just a fraction of a second too long. And then I noticed something that I probably should have noticed the first day he was born. My son had dark eyes. Truly dark. Almost black. The kind that don't carry any blue or green behind them. I had blue eyes. My wife had green eyes. I knew that eye color genetics weren't straightforward. But I also remembered something a nurse had said at the hospital. Casually. That I'd let go at the time. She'd said he had his grandfather's coloring. I'd assumed she meant my wife's side. Now I wasn't sure she meant anyone related to either of us at all. I didn't schedule a paternity test because I wanted to. I scheduled it because I needed the truth more than I needed to stay comfortable. A home DNA kit takes 3 to 5 business days. I got the results on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Whataburger. I sat in that parking lot for an hour after I read it. I'd been raising a son who wasn't biologically mine. What I did with that information over the next several days is something I'm not entirely proud of, and something I think was also entirely necessary. I called a family law attorney. Not a consultation. I called my brother first, who is the kind of person who doesn't panic and always knows the right question to ask. He said, "Before you do anything, understand your legal position." So I called an attorney. What she told me was difficult to hear. In Texas, when a child is born during a marriage, the husband is presumed to be the father. That presumption is legally protected. There is a window. 4 years from the birth of the child, or 1 year from when you discovered, or reasonably should have discovered the facts, to challenge that presumption in court. I was inside that window. Barely. But it wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be fast, and there was no guarantee, because Texas courts weigh the best interest of the child above nearly everything else. The attorney was patient with me. She explained it twice. I took notes on a Whataburger napkin. Then I went home, and I told my wife I knew. I'm not going to dramatize that conversation. I don't think it needs it. She didn't deny it. She sat down at the kitchen table, and she looked at her hands, and she told me that it had happened while we were dating. That she had ended it before we got engaged. That when she found out she was pregnant, she had done the math and convinced herself it was mine. That she had needed it to be mine. I asked her if she was sure about that. If she had actually convinced herself, or if she had just hoped. I wouldn't find out. She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "I think both." I told her I needed her to leave. She called her sister in Corpus Christi that same night. She was gone by the following afternoon. She took what she needed for a few weeks, and she took my son, and I stood in the living room of my house after the car pulled out of the driveway, and I looked at the bouncy chair still sitting in the corner of the room, and I thought, I don't know who I am right now. I genuinely did not know. My daughter Bree was staying with my ex-wife that week. When I called her, I told her there had been some problems between her stepmom and me. She was 13. She knew enough to know what I wasn't saying. The legal process took 18 months. I'm going to tell you what that looks like from the inside because nobody warns you. It's not dramatic. It's paperwork and waiting. And phone calls. And more paperwork. It's hiring a guardian ad litem for your son, who is a stranger appointed by the court. to represent the interests of a child who is 9 months old and has no idea any of this is happening. It's sitting across a conference table from your wife's attorney while your own attorney explains that the other side is arguing you formed a parental bond and that the court should consider the child's interest in maintaining that bond regardless of biology. They were not wrong that I had formed a bond. That was the hardest part. I had changed his diapers and rocked him at 2 in the morning and sung him the same 3 songs on repeat until he fell asleep. I had held him in the parking lot of the pediatrician's office one afternoon when he had a fever. And I was scared and the office was closing. I loved him. That was real. But I had been deceived. That was also real. My attorney filed to disestablish paternity. The court ordered a second DNA test, an official one this time, submitted through a certified lab with chain of custody documentation. I sat in a clinic and swabbed my cheek, and the technician was completely indifferent to the whole situation, which I found oddly steadying. The results confirmed what I already knew. The biological father, according to my wife, was someone she had worked with at a previous firm. He was now married and living in another state. To my knowledge, he had not been told about any of this. That is a separate tragedy I've had to make peace with. One I'm not sure I fully have. My wife and I were officially divorced 11 months after I asked her to leave. The division of assets was straightforward. The house was mine. We didn't have much else to split. The paternity case took another 7 months after that. I won, technically. My name was removed from my son's birth certificate. I was released from any legal obligation to provide support. The court did note in its ruling that I had been deceived, and that the deception had been material to my assumption of the parental role. That language mattered to my attorney. She said it was significant. I drove home from the courthouse and I sat in my backyard for a long time. My brother called that evening. He asked how I was doing, and I told him I didn't know how to answer that. He said that was probably the most honest thing I'd said in 2 years, which is the kind of thing only a sibling can say and have it land right. The biological father was eventually contacted through a legal process I won't get into in full detail. He did not respond well initially. I don't know what his life looks like now, or what relationship, if any, he has with my son. That chapter belongs to them, not to me. What I'll tell you is what happened to me after. I went back to work the Monday, following the courthouse ruling. I drove out to a job site in New Braunfels, put on my hard hat, and spent 8 hours pulling wire through a conduit system that needed to be in by Friday. There's something about that kind of work, physical, precise, with a clear outcome, that I've always been grateful for. At the end of the day, you can look at the wall and say, that's done. That works. I needed that. Bree was with me most of that summer. She was 14 by then, and she handled more than I gave her credit for. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She made coffee in the morning and left it on the counter for me, which she'd never done before. And every time I think about it, I have to look away for a second. Kids figure out how to love you in the language they have. I think she knew I was wrecked, and she just decided to make coffee. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I had gotten a paternity test the day my son was born. Not because I suspected anything. I didn't. But because I know now that not knowing isn't the same as it being fine. 2 years later, I read an article about how paternity fraud affects somewhere between 1% and 3% of births, and that most of the men involved never find out. Some people say that statistic is peace of mind. I find it the opposite of peace of mind. I wish I had talked to an attorney the day I heard that phone call instead of waiting 2 weeks. Not because it would have changed the outcome. I think it would have been the same. But because those 2 weeks of carrying it alone were some of the worst I've spent. What I don't regret is the time I spent with my son. I know that might be hard to understand. But he was a real little person who needed someone to hold him, and I was there. Whatever the biology was, that part was real. I've had to figure out how to carry that. The love that doesn't have anywhere to go anymore. And I'm still figuring it out. About a year everything was finalized. I had dinner with a woman I'd met through someone at work. Nothing came of it, and that was fine. But sitting across from someone and having a real conversation for the first time in what felt like years reminded me that I wasn't entirely closed down. There's something stubborn in me that insists on still being alive, even when I've given it decent reasons not to bother. I'm 51 now. Bree is a sophomore in college studying nursing. She calls me on Sundays, usually while she's doing laundry. I have a dog named Reg, who destroyed 2 of my couch cushions in the first month I had him and has been otherwise perfect. I still work for the same company. I'm still in the same house. I don't talk about this much. I haven't told most people the whole story. Just the rough shape of it. Divorced again. Yeah, things didn't work out. Most people don't push past that, and I don't invite them to. But I've been thinking lately that silence about certain things isn't the same as protecting yourself. Sometimes it's just letting something rot in the dark, instead of taking it outside where it might actually break down into something manageable. So here it is. I had a good life, and someone chose to lie inside of it. Not out of malice, maybe, or not only out of malice, out of fear, out of wanting, out of telling herself a story that was easier to live in than the truth. I understand that impulse. I don't forgive it. What I learned, the hard way and then the harder way, is that you don't actually get to know everything that's happening in your own house. You trust the person across the table from you, because that's what marriage is. A sustained act of faith in someone else's honesty. And when that's gone, when the faith turns out to have been misplaced, the question isn't just, what do I do now? The question is, how do I trust the next thing? I don't have a clean answer to that. I don't think there is one. What I have is this: Bree calling on Sundays. Red chewing something he shouldn't. A truck that still runs clean. Work that ends each day with something you can look at and say that's done. It turns out that's enough to keep going. I'm not sure it's enough to be whole, but I'm working on the difference.